Welcome to the Venari podcast. As part of our HealthTech CEO series, it's good to introduce Josh Miller, CEO of Gradient Health. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
So, Josh, to kick off, tell us a little bit about Gradient Health and ultimately, how you can change healthcare for the better, really.
We originally set out to build a mammography AI when we started this company. Just realized there was no easy way to get access to the data for training such an algorithm or for doing the regulatory filing for such an algorithm. And so we realized, look, the world shouldn't work that way. If someone wants to build a product that's going to end up saving lives or lessening the cost of healthcare, they shouldn't have to wait 12 months, spend a ton of money just to get access to the data they need. And so we really started to solve that problem. So what we did was we went around the world. We de-identified medical imaging from about 1,000 different clinical sites, and then made it available for research. And that's where the story started.
Oh, fantastic! So when did this all start? And you say a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so this all got started about 3 years ago or so. Same co-founder from my first startup, which was also in the imaging space. So we're like an old married couple at this point. We argue, but we love each other very much. And so this is us doing our second startup, and already we've seen quite a bit of success.
Fantastic. So, in terms of the space, and that we operate very much in that space, and I know it quite well. I mean, what differentiates you, sorry, from a lot of your competitors?
Yeah, I mean, I'm never one to talk bad about competitors, so I'll kind of talk about what Gradient's really good at, right?
Yeah.
The scale of the data, right? So we've got data sets from all around the world, and processing and handling that scale of data and having real access is fairly difficult. A lot of companies in the space are kind of a manifest of where data is. We actually have the data sitting on our own servers, right? Which means that to deliver a data set, it can take us, a day, sometimes 2 days, but especially for these larger scale data sets that are above 1,000, that's a real competitive advantage. I would say the other kind of competitive advantage we have in the space is just the speed and scale of de-identification. That's a really hard problem to solve, and so a lot of that kind of technology came through from our last startup.
Fantastic. And I suppose you did touch on it a little bit about kind of your previous startup, but maybe go a little bit deeper in terms of how did you end up with Gradient, and tell us about your life before becoming a CEO and founder, and how did you lead to all this?
For sure. I guess I'm a serial entrepreneur. I never feel that way, right? Did my background's in computer vision and electrical engineering. My co-founder Owen and I actually started our first company doing satellite image analysis. Started that in school, took it through a startup incubator called Y Combinator. Grew it pretty big, raised some venture capital, and had a pretty solid exit on that business, to a company called Syngenta based in Switzerland. Stuck around, needed a couple years in corporate to kind of recover from the first startup, right? And then, eventually I felt the calling again. And I think when it comes to startups, the best way to think about a startup is a way in which you want the world to work, but in a way that it doesn't currently, right? So like you find something where you're like, really the world should work this way, but it doesn't. And we found that in medical imaging research, right? And we've really hit on pretty serious problem in the space. I mean, today Gradient's got over 60 customers. That includes some of the big pharma companies, a lot of the big med device companies, a lot of the AI and radiology companies, and then obviously some of the equipment manufacturers.
Fantastic. And how big are you as a company in terms of boots on the ground, really?
Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of been of the philosophy that you keep it a small, tight team until you're really ready to be big. So Gradient's actually about 15 folks. We're based primarily in Durham, North Carolina, right across from Duke University, if you've ever been over in that neck of the woods. And then we've got actually about a third of our team in Brazil.
I'm thinking, where do you see yourselves in the next kind of 2 years, really? I mean, how is Gradient going to evolve?
We've done really well in radiology imaging. So we're at the place where someone can come to us and say, look, I want a biopsy confirmed lung cancer data set of 10,000 nodules. And we can turn that around in a week, right? And that's quite unique in the space, right? Especially when it comes to that level of organization. So we've been able to help Some pretty interesting companies that are doing some pretty cool stuff. Now that we've got kind of radiology down pat, we're starting to expand over into other indications, right? So we're looking at ophthalmology and things along those lines. The other thing that's kind of been an interesting dynamic in this space is you've seen kind of companies transitioning from a point model where they're looking for 1,000 examples of one particular disease, right? To foundation models where they're looking for, look, I no longer want 1,000 lung nodule cases of, lung rats 4. I now want 100,000 lung CTs so I can train a foundation model that can recognize
Yeah.
any disease, right, within a CT. And so there's been that interesting market dynamic, right? So kind of where I'm most excited is like the scale that this stuff is happening at, and then kind of these adjacent fields like ophthalmology that we're starting to have some pretty big success in.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And because of that, have you had to kind of pivot in any way because of that kind of market change or?
No, we had kind of built the technology to scale for that, kind of seeing this coming. And so that's been really, really good for us, right? When you think about the computational power that it takes to organize petabytes worth of data and actually do the de-identification properly and safely at that scale,
Mhm.
that's really flipping hard to do, right? And so we had kind of built, let's say we over optimized a little early on being able to do that, but the benefits are coming through now.
My kind of background has always been more commercial, and
Yeah.
my interest really here is that clearly both yourself and your co-founder kind of come from that tech background. You kind of built two very successful startups by the sounds of it, and you've commercially seem to have done quite well in terms of bringing customers through. Like, what kind of challenges have you seen there, and how has that kind of developed? I mean, did you bring in somebody to help you on that side, or has that been very much kind of product led?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, like I do come from a technical background, but I'm a terrible engineer, right? Like, so I've always kind of been an operator throughout my career, right? Like I can speak the language,
Yeah.
but I can't necessarily walk the walk, right? I can write some Python scripts, and that's about it. But I'm a big believer in founder-led sales up until a Series A,
Yeah.
right? So we do have a chief revenue officer whose name is Rod Greco. I imagine a lot of folks who are going to listen to this all know Rod. He's very beloved kind of in the community. But him and I are our primary sales team, right? So our sales team today is about 4 folks on that 15
Mhm.
person.
I suppose on that, and just thinking about where you guys are heading in the next couple of years, I mean, do you have international scope as well? Do you operate outside of the US?
We do. I mean, I would say only about a third of our customers are within the US,
Mhm.
right? We've got huge concentrations in France, in Israel, in Korea, to some degree in China, and a handful of other geographies, right? But the majority of our customers, interestingly enough, are outside of the US, right? And a lot of what it is it's international companies trying to get a 510(k) approval for the radiology device right here in
Yeah.
the US, right? So it's international companies that don't already have connections to hospitals, but are looking for a data set that can go through and do an FDA filing with.
I suppose kind of final question really from my side, Josh, would be, you've done this twice. No doubt you probably do it again. What advice do you have for other founders within tech?
The biggest trap that I see people fall into is waiting for a perfect idea. Every idea kind of starts off bad, right? So it's more important than that you get started rather than wait for the perfect idea. Because what'll happen is you start with like a pretty mediocre idea, you learn a lot, and that eventually makes its way over to being a good idea, right? It's kind of what happened with Gradient, right? Two dudes in Owen's house, right? Like him and I just like sitting on a couch being like, hey, can we make a radiology AI? Wasn't a great start, right? If we hadn't gotten started on that, we would have never kind of discovered the problem
Yeah.
that Gradient Health solves. And so I think the greatest advice I can give is just get started. Like, don't wait for something that's perfect. Um, because the way startups are formed is they're formed kind of naturally over time. And you will find by starting on a bad idea, chances are you'll encounter a good idea.
No, that's great advice, to be honest. I mean, just yeah, I suppose kind of seeing it through and almost just at least kicking it off really.
Oh yeah,
From the
yeah,
get.
yeah. And that's 90% of the battle of being a founder, right? Is like the emotional humps you kind of have to get over, right?
Mhm.
Because often it's if you build a product with product market fit, the only thing that can hold the business back is one, co-founder disputes, right? And two, just like losing faith in yourself, right? Which is the biggest challenge that I think founders deal with.
Great advice, and thanks very much for joining us, Josh. And I
Yeah,
really appreciate your time.
yeah. Thank you for having me. And always feel free to reach out. Josh at Gradient Health.io.